Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Schaffenbuhl, one of the regional managers of loss control with Argent, a division of West Bend Mutual Insurance. Today's webinar is on OSHA Walking and Working Surface Standard, the update. OSHA, as part of the agenda, we'll go through the background, give you a little history on how we got to where we are with this standard, and then talk about some of the primary changes in the standard. My intent isn't to review the entire standard, it's just to talk about the changes and specifically the changes that impact the majority of our insureds. For example, I'm not going to talk about rope descent systems from scaffolding. I don't know that any of our insureds would utilize a rope descent system. And so we're going to go through the primary changes. And some of the changes are major. In the majority of the changes, however, are allow more flexibility for you as covered under OSHA to adopt fall protection that's best suited for your organization instead of what OSHA used to require in a very prescriptive manner. And so we'll talk about that change. Specifically, realize that OSHA went into effect in 1971, and 2 years later, in 1973, they realized their walking and working surface standard, handrails, guardrails, stairways, those types of things, was inadequate, and they started to update the standard at that time. They withdrew the request to restudy at some point in time. By 1990, they issued a proposed standard, said, look, this is what we want to implement a standard, please give us feedback, and they just never finalized it. 2003, OSHA said, we're going to try this again. We're going to try to revise the existing standard, and so 2003, they reopened the record. Finally, 7 years after that, they published a proposed standard, and another 6 years after that, they published the final standard that we have today, and that's going to be discussed in this webinar. I should point out that this final standard, plus the supporting material, was 513 pages in length. That's pretty typical. A typical OSHA standard might be 10 pages to 30 pages, typically not that long. But then there was another 500 pages of supporting material. This timeline here is not that different than a lot of OSHA regulations. OSHA never is able to quickly promulgate a standard. It does take them a considerable amount of time. OSHA decided they need to address slips and falls in the workplace because it is the second leading cause of death in general industry. The leading cause of death, if you don't know, is motor vehicle accidents. And what they find about slips, trips, and falls, 1/3 of those that do occur are falls to lower level, or about 270 a year. What I think is interesting is the industry with the most fatal falls to a lower level is the administrative and support services industry, people that are doing building maintenance. They have the greatest, their fatalities are due to slips, trips, and falls from elevation, falls to a lower level, as OSHA words it. But this is true. Think about your maintenance staff, and really keep that in mind as you go through this presentation. For the majority of you that are listening, it's going to be your maintenance staff that are most impacted by this regulation. But you'll also see that all of you will have a new obligation to create a safer work environment. Falls to lower level that don't result in fatality, but a fall in lower level that results in lost time, results in an average of 20 days away from work. Because of OSHA's emphasis on the falls to lower level, that's the primary changes that we see in the standard. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about ladders. We'll talk about the new requirement that everybody does inspections, slip, trip, and fall inspections. As I mentioned before, OSHA is moving away from a specification-based standard to a performance-based standard. What that means is OSHA, instead of telling you that you need to paint a wall a contrasting color, they just say you need to mark it in some way that it's easily delineated. And so it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. One, it's good, it gives you more flexibility in how you want to comply. But it's bad because if OSHA doesn't think it was adequate, they can easily issue a citation. So it's a double-edged sword, and you'll see some examples of that as I go through this presentation. So as a background, the standard, as I mentioned, talks about general inspection requirement, ladders. I'm not going to go into step bolts and manholes because the majority of you don't go into manholes and deal with manhole steps, not stops. Stairways, we'll talk about. Dock boards a little bit. I'm not going to talk about scaffolds and rope descent systems. What OSHA did was said, look, if you're using scaffolds in your workplace, you need to follow the construction industry requirements. I'm going to talk about fall protection and the new training requirement. Again, this training requirement applies in certain circumstances, but it doesn't apply to all employees, so we'll talk about that. As I said, OSHA is trying to align the general industry, and that's everybody that's not in agriculture, construction, and a few others that I can't think of off of my top of my head. But it says, look, if you're in general industry, you're in manufacturing, you're in transportation, you're in the healthcare industry, schools, colleges, school districts, those types of things, you're considered general industry, you need to comply with these changes. Sometimes, though, your employees are engaged in activities that may be considered construction. So do you follow the construction standards or the general industry standards? It depends. It's not as big of a difference anymore after these changes. They're pretty much in line. The big key is that in general industry, if you or employer exposed to a fall of 4 feet or more, then you have to be provided with fall protection. In construction industry, it's 6 feet or more. However, as I said, there are certain activities that occur that are construction in nature. OSHA says, look, general maintenance activities where you're keeping a structure, a fixture, a foundation in proper condition in a routine, scheduled, or anticipated manner, that is a general industry activity. That's not specifically construction. However, if OSHA comes into your facility, your employees are tearing out a wall and putting in a new wall, they're going to look at whether it's construction activity or general industry activity on a case-by-case basis. They give consideration to the nature of the work. I'd say tearing out a wall and putting a new one in is going to be construction activity. They're going to look at the schedule of the work. Is it scheduled activity or is it an emergency maintenance repair? That makes a difference. Is it anticipated and routine? They're going to look at the scale and the complexity of the activity. Just patching a hole in the wall would most likely be a maintenance activity, but building a new wall would be a construction activity. They're going to look at the physical size of the object being worked on. So they take all this into consideration. So it's not like I can easily say a construction activity is a construction activity when your employees are performing maintenance work, but typical maintenance activities are going to be covered under the general duty requirement. So if your employees are going on top of the roof to change out filters in an air handling system, that's going to fall under the general duty requirements and not the construction requirements. The only odd little caveat is painting. For whatever reason, painting is considered a construction activity, generally, the majority of the time. And why that is, I have no idea, but that's just one of OSHA's little nuances in life. I want to briefly mention what a walking working surface is. OSHA says a walking working surface is any horizontal or vertical surface on which an employee walks, works, or gains access to a work area or workplace location. So walking or working surface is anything that you can walk on, may stand on to perform work activities. It could even be something you might sit on to perform a work activity. But typically it's a walking or a working surface. It's someplace that you'd walk or work from. A working surface then is anywhere where you are working from. So something that may be a roof typically isn't a working surface, but if I have to go onto the roof to perform an activity, that is now my working surface, and I have to make sure I take appropriate protections in that situation. The general requirements, I wouldn't want to say they haven't changed, but there are some nuances. You know, the general requirement for all walking and working surfaces is that they must be kept clean, orderly, in a sanitary condition. Floors must be kept clean and to the extent feasible dry. OSHA recognizes there are some workplaces that the floor is always wet, and so then they have certain requirements, and you should review the specific specifications for that. And they say that walking and working surfaces must be free of protruding objects, loose boards, corrosion, spills, leaks, snow, and ice. And that means you need to make sure that your aisleways and your walkways are free of tools, materials, debris. They even mention pallets specifically, so that you don't create a tripping hazard, that you don't create a struck by against hazard. And this goes to the new requirement that OSHA has that all workplaces must do walking and working surface inspections. One of the changes right away that you notice if you review the entire regulation is OSHA says that the walking and working surface must support the maximum intended load of the surface. They've gotten away from the requirement to have a posting to say what the maximum floor loading is. You'd often see citations issued when an employer wouldn't have a mezzanine posted as to what the floor capacity is. OSHA realized that posting the capacity and knowing what it is and adhering to it are different things. And so they say, look, know what the capacity is, have a process to do that, don't overload it, but you don't have to post a sign. The next one is another major change, and again, they're giving flexibility, is that the employer must provide and ensure each employee uses a safe means of access and egress to and from working surfaces. OSHA used to say you had to have permanent aisles. That's gone away. However, in that 513 pages of supporting material, OSHA specifically says, look, you don't have to mark your permanent aisles, but it's a really easy way to make it clear that employees have a safe means of access. They removed the specific requirement of ensuring adequate space when using mechanical equipment. It used to be that if you use forklifts and pedestrians, you had to make sure there was adequate space. And that specific verbiage has gone away, but imagine you had a pedestrian hit in your facility. They were hospitalized. You called OSHA as you have to notify them of a hospitalization. How do you prove to OSHA you met the requirement of ensuring that you provided a safe means of access and egress? And so while they're giving you flexibility in how you go about doing this, it's still important you take the time. Are there adequate aisleways? Are the aisleways wide enough? Do they allow employees to safely work in the area and perform their work activities? So while there's increased flexibility, OSHA is not going to come and look for line markings anymore, aisle markings anymore. But how do you demonstrate to OSHA that you are providing adequate access? Here's the big change, or one of the major big changes. OSHA has come out and said, look, Mr. Ms. Employer, you need to inspect the workplace. And specifically, walking and working surfaces must be inspected regularly and as necessary and maintained in a safe condition. And don't you just love that word, regular and necessary? And I'll talk about how OSHA defines regular and necessary in a second. They say that any hazardous conditions in walking working surfaces need to be corrected or repaired before an employee uses that surface again. If the correction or repair cannot be made immediately, the hazard must be guarded to prevent employees from using the walking and working surface until the hazard is corrected. And they go on to say that if any correction or repair involves structural integrity of the walking and working surface, a qualified person performs or supervises the correction or repair. So if you have a walking surface that has a major hole in it, you just can't have a maintenance employee go slap some concrete in it. And to fix it, especially if it's structural, you need to make sure that the repair is done properly. So, regular and necessary. What does that mean to OSHA? OSHA basically says, look, you need to have a schedule that is appropriate for the working and walking surface, and the hazards that are likely to be present. So in your facility, you wouldn't necessarily have the same schedule for all parts of the facility. Parts that are more likely to have contaminants, more likely to have obstructions, more likely to have damage and traffic would likely be scheduled at a more frequent basis, where those that are less likely to see traffic maybe have a record storage room down in the basement. How often do people go there? Once a month, once a quarter? You may be completely acceptable to a quarterly or an annual inspection of that type of area. So you just need to keep in mind, what's appropriate. One of the things I would look at is if I'm doing the inspections and I keep on finding hazards every time I'm doing the inspection, it's telling me that the frequency isn't adequate enough. And then OSHA goes on to say, look, once you identify the frequency at which you are going to do the inspections, you must do the inspections at that frequency. So OSHA is saying, look, you tell us how often you're doing them. So we come into the workplace and find out that you're not doing it with that frequency, and it makes it easy for us to give you a citation. I want to stress that OSHA does not say it needs to be a formal schedule. It can be formal or informal, but you're going to have some means, and employees will be interviewed if there is ever a citation possible. But you and employees need to be able to communicate how did you establish the schedule, whatever the schedule happens to be, how do you ensure that it's being done. For me, I think it's easy enough, and in the handouts, along with the handouts today, there was another link for a working surface inspection schedule. And to me, this is what I would offer up to OSHA. It's what I'd create for a business I work for. Just identifies the different areas and the frequency and the responsible party for doing the inspection. I have restrooms now. Restrooms are an area where they're likely to have liquids on the floor, spills from the sink, those types of things. And so you want to inspect it, I think, on a daily basis. Entrances in the parking lot. You want to make sure you're looking at that at some frequency. What's interesting in that supporting material OSHA provided that say, you should go out and immediately inspect the parking lot or exterior area after any severe weather event. It's not in the standard, but it's in the preamble. So OSHA is saying, look, if you have a terrible windstorm come through and knock down and create tripping hazards, you should go out and inspect that and make sure that's all cleared up before employees use that walking working surface. Or the same is true as OSHA specifically calls out snow and ice. You have a blizzard, you want to make sure you're going out inspecting the surface to make sure it's safe to walk on. And so you can see there the third line down in my sample is entrances and parking lot. In November through April, typical times of snow, ice in the Midwest, we're going to go out and do a daily inspection of the walking and working surfaces, and then immediately following any severe weather event, blizzard, snow, freezing rain, etc. Talk about, just emergency exits, making sure emergency exits as they're walking and working surface when you need them. Those that aren't frequently used, making sure they're free and unobstructed. Production areas, maybe you need to do those weekly or maybe daily. Again, it depends on your organization, and you have to determine what's appropriate for your needs. I also then put together a really sample easy, simple checklist. OSHA doesn't specify what's in the checklist. They just say they don't specify what you do in your inspection. So I created a checklist that really looks at the important aspects. Specifically, you look at, is the walking and working surface clean and orderly? Is it free from obstructions? Are there tools, cords, materials? If you're in a nursing home, walkers, gate belts on the floor that could pose a tripping hazard. If you have a warehouse, are there pallets in the walkways? Is it free from contaminants? Obstructions are things you generally trip over. Contaminants are generally things you slip on. So is it free from oil, snow, ice, debris, water, other spills, etc.? And then are there protruding objects? OSHA really has put this in. That's a minor change. They're really looking at protruding objects. They don't want to see things sticking up from floors or sticking into walkways that create protrusion hazards, struck by against hazards, lacerations. They don't want to see clothing snag, those types of things. If there's any hole in a walking surface, is it repaired or covered? Are walking and working surfaces appropriate for the work activities? And so just a really simple checklist. You can create your own. It doesn't have to necessarily be anything fancy, but I want to make sure at a minimum you're covering what OSHA requires. It's also important, once you're completing these inspections, how are you going to document that they were done? Who's going to maintain the documentation? If you're going to have documentation, how are you going to follow up on the inspection to make sure that the inspection is being completed? But this inspection requirement went into effect on January 17th of this year in federal states, so Wisconsin, Illinois, are the primary, in Nebraska, the primary ones that we work in. For Iowa and Michigan, I'm not sure when those states, I haven't seen yet when those states are going to implement this, but in the federal plan states, this requirement is already in place. Continuing on, going on to the next topic, OSHA really changed the ladder requirements. OSHA used to have requirements for wood ladders, metal ladders, and they've gotten rid of all of that. They've gone to one set of standards for all ladders. And keep in mind that a step stool is a ladder. I see a lot of businesses have step stools that are completely inappropriate, but they're a ladder, so you need to make sure they're treated like a ladder and they're maintained like a ladder. One of the things that I saw that, to me, that was unique is that OSHA says that ladders must be of sufficient strength to carry the intended load. So that's going to be the person and any tools they have or objects that they're carrying. A lot of people used to rely upon the duty ratings of ladders, whether it was a light duty, heavy duty, household duty. And this is the reason I bring this up, is I see a lot of household duty step ladders in workplaces, and there's nothing wrong with it being household duty. The thing is that a household duty step ladder either has a 175-pound or a 200-pound weight capacity. And if you look at the average person in the population of this country, and you look at if they're doing anything at all, carrying any tools, equipment, maybe they're putting a case of food away on a small step stool, they're going to be over that capacity. And so it's not about going out and buying the cheapest ladder, the cheapest step stool that's available. It's buying one that's appropriate for the work that's going to be performed on it. OSHA specifically came out and said you need to inspect ladders before initial use, and each initial use in each work shift and more frequently as necessary. So basically, a ladder must be inspected each time it's used. If it's used more than once during a shift, it's okay if it's just inspected at the beginning of each shift. OSHA does not specifically say that training is required for ladder usage. The ANSI standards on ladders, or at least the plastic, the wood and metal ones that I reviewed yesterday, do not specify that training must be provided on ladders. OSHA even talked about the fact they were not going to mandate ladder safety training. However, you as an employer have an obligation to follow the manufacturer's requirements, and all manufacturers of ladders specifically state that employees must read and follow the ladder instructions that are on the rail of the ladder. So it's critical. Make sure employees take the time to read and follow the instructions. Personally, myself, I think you're better off if you provide ladder training to make sure employees are properly using step ladders, extension ladders, because there are some specific requirements that you want to make sure are followed to prevent injury to employees. Specifically, OSHA has come out and said the employee must face the ladder when climbing up and down the ladder. Employees must always grasp the ladder with one hand on the ladder when climbing up or down. And when OSHA says grasp, they really mean grasp. They specifically talk about the fact that if you're going up an extension ladder and keep your hands behind the rungs, you just can't slide your hands down behind. They want you to grasp. How they're going to verify this, I have no idea. But it just makes for interesting thoughts and discussions. But they always want employees to have 3 points of contact. 2 hands and a feet, or 2 feet and a hand should always be in contact with the ladder at all times. And OSHA specifically states they do not want employees carrying anything that could cause an employee to lose balance and fall while climbing up and down the ladder. So if you have something tiny in your hand that allows you to still grasp the ladder, that's fine. But if you have something in your hand that prevents you from having a firm grasp of that ladder, OSHA is saying that's possible. That's a possible citation. And so you need to keep that in mind. Do you provide a bucket with a rope that they can pull up? Do you have a means to get tools and supplies to the employees as they're going up the ladder? What's that process? We don't want to rely upon the employee carrying that cordless drill in their hand and try to climb up the ladder. OSHA says that spreader bars must be in the open and locked position when a step ladder is in use. You can see down in the lower right hand there is a picture of a ladder that even I used at one point in time. It's a cement vault I had to get on top of. Only had a step ladder, but that's improper use. That spreader bar there isn't properly extended. In the upper right hand, you see a picture of a platform ladder. More and more we see those. I would encourage any of you that if you're going out to buy a step ladder, to buy a platform ladder, because where you can work on that platform, it provides you a much larger, more stable working area, and then you have the protection of the rail there. I have seen some general contractors requiring platform ladders of their subs. And then OSHA says that you can only use ladders on stable and level surfaces unless secured or stabilized. And I just wanted to provide 2 examples of 2 different types of extension ladder stabilizers that are available. They have devices that you can attach to ladders that make them much more stable and secure so employees can safely go up and down the ladder. When you have a fixed ladder, and fixed ladders have the biggest changes of all, in my opinion, but if you have a fixed ladder, you must have grab bars that extend 42 inches above the access level or landing as part of that going up the fixed ladder. You can't have that fixed ladder end at the roof or top of the wall, whatever you're using the fixed ladder for. The grab bars must extend 42 inches above that, and it gives some requirements for grab bars. Any fixed ladder over 24 feet installed after February 19th of 2018 must have a fall arrest system. Fixed ladders installed after 2/19 of 18 have no need to have a cage, and in the future there's really no need to put a cage on at all because the ladder must have a fall arrest system, and I'll give an example here in a slide or 2. And any fixed ladder that's currently in place that's more than 24 feet, 20 years from November 18th, 2016, so November 18th of 2036, in 20 years all fixed ladders must have a fall arrest system. OSHA recognizes that cages on ladders do absolutely nothing other than direct the splat of the person when they fall. And so, as I said, new ladders and any existing ladder after 11/18 of 2036 must have a ladder fall arrest system. These two pictures on this slide here are two different types of a ladder fall arrest system. One uses a cable. The one on the right uses a cable with a carrier, and the one on the left uses a channel with a carrier. And there's different options. Sometimes, especially on the cable one, you might have to manually release the cable. The cable has to be held in place various distances up the ladder. And so as you go up, the carrier hits that, and then the employee couldn't go up any higher. So you have to release the cable from the holder. You're not exposing yourself to a fall hazard. You just release the cable from the holder, you go past it, then you have to put the cable back in. So they have different types of cable systems. Some are manual like that. Some will automatically bypass the holder. The track system doesn't have that problem. You can go up and down. They have requirements about the lanyard between the connector and the person's harness can only be 9 inches. With going to a fall arrest system instead of cages, instead of having platforms every 50 feet now on fixed ladders, OSHA says you can go up to 150 feet in height without a rest platform. And talking to some people that climb a lot of ladders, they really hate that because at 50 feet you kind of want to take a break, get off on your platform, your rest platform, and then continue on up. Well, now the issue is you're going to have this restraint device. You should be able to just, stand on your feet, lean back a little bit, and get some rest that way for your arms so you're not climbing the entire time. So that's a major change. I should point out that, like most regulations that were passed at the end of the Obama administration, lawsuits were filed against them. Everything I'm talking about today, there have been no lawsuits filed against it that are going to potentially impede this from or cause this to be retracted or redacted. The things I'm discussing today are in effect, and there's no court cases outstanding to cause them to be taken out of the law. Specifically, a change regarding outdoor advertising. Billboard climbers do not need to be protected. They just need to be trained on how not to fall. And OSHA says, look, we can't accept that anymore. So the billboard industry has filed a lawsuit against the specific requirements for them. There's been one other change in the regulations that a lawsuit was filed on. But none of the lawsuits impact the content of the webinar today. OSHA has gotten more strict on mobile ladder stands. I personally have a lot of heartburn with mobile ladder stands because I see a ladder stand like the one in the picture there that doesn't have handrails on it, doesn't have a platform at the top or handrails at the top to provide a stable protection for an employee then they get to the top. That ladder there, that rolling ladder there, doesn't need handrails because it's only 40 inches tall. OSHA specifically states if the top step is 4 feet or taller, then the platform needs to have handrails going up along the sides and around the upper platform. If the platform is 4 to 10 feet in height, the handrails must be at least 36 inches high with mid-rails. And if the platform is over 10 feet in height, the top platform is over 10 feet in height, then the platform must be at least 16 inches deep and include guardrails, a mid-board, and toe board. And they have put in some requirements. You'll find that most rolling ladders, most mobile ladder stands like this already meet these requirements. Steps must be at least 16 inches wide. The employee must not move, or the mobile ladder stand must not move when the employee is on it, so there must be a way to keep it from moving. There needs to be a braking system, whereas you see the one here, it's just that the casters are spring-loaded, and once the person puts weight on it, the casters go up and the rubber feet come down. One change is that the steps on the top of the platform must be slip-resistant. Most of them are some type of expanded metal, and so it's got some grip to it. But if you have one that's just completely smooth metal, you want to make sure that there was some adhesive tape or something put on that to prevent people from slipping on that. So that is some changes for the mobile ladder stand. The first time OSHA has really clarified their expectation for them. Stairways. OSHA made a change that really surprised me. It used to be that you had to have 7 feet of vertical clearance over a stairway. OSHA has now lowered that to 6 feet 8. See, this standard is all about getting more generous. OSHA says that stairs should be provided to permit access from one work surface to another when regular and routine travel occurs. And OSHA says, look, if you're going between work surfaces more than once a day, stairs should be provided. And so if it's the transition of, 8 inches, 9.5 inches or more, then you're going to have multiple. If it's more than 9.5 inches, you're going to have 2 steps. But they say, look, we don't want to use ladders. We don't want to use other types of access when we're routinely going between, two different elevations. OSHA says, look, if you can't fit a traditional staircase in, spiral staircases, ship staircases, they're just a really steep staircase, and alternative tread-type stairs are permitted if it's not feasible to use standard stairs. This is the first time OSHA has come out and really acknowledged that in regulation, that they will accept ship and alternative tread-type stairs. OSHA then also has come out and said, look, stairs have to have a maximum, cannot have a riser height exceeding 9.5 inches, and they have to have a minimum tread depth of 9.5 inches. Used to be OSHA had a very detailed table before that said if your rise was this, your run had to be that, and they've said, look, we're going to be more in line with building code, and you can have a rise of a maximum of 9.5 inches and a tread depth of a minimum of 9.5 inches, and as long as they're consistent, step riser height is consistent throughout these steps, you're okay. Any stair landing that's over 4 feet in height needs to be protected with a guardrail or a stair rail, and we'll talk about the difference between guardrail, stair rail, and handrails here shortly. Stairs with at least 3 treads and 4 risers must have stair rails and handrails, and I'm not going to get into the specifications because they really haven't changed, but it's important. If you have 3 treads and 4 risers, and this set of stairs here does not meet this, but if you have at least 3 treads and 4 risers, you need to have stair rails and handrails. And this is different. It used to be we've always focused on handrails, and now we see OSHA coming to realize that handrails need to be at one height and stair rails need to be at a different height. Handrails, OSHA has given a lot more flexibility than used to exist. OSHA now says, look, handrails need to be between 30 and 38 inches above the leading edge of the stair tread. I'll show an image here shortly of how to measure that or where it's measured from. But then you need to have stair rails. I'll show a picture of the difference between a handrail and a stair rail. But any stair rail installed prior to 117 of 17 cannot be less than 30 inches above the leading edge of a stair, and that's acceptable. Any stair rail built after 117 of 17 needs to be at least 42 inches above the leading edge of the stair tread. So we're going to see combination stair rails and handrails now in new staircases. And you already see it in new commercial buildings. It's just in the industrial environment and factories and businesses, it wasn't specifically mandated by OSHA, but it's been part of the building code for general occupancy for quite some time. Now, a stair rail can serve as a handrail if the stair rail is at least 36 inches and not less than 36 inches or more than 38 inches above the stair tread. So if the stair rail is between 36 inches and 38 inches, it can serve as the handrail. So that's going to be anything built prior to 117 of 17. And here I want to show you. Here you see a great example of a handrail. That's going to be the lower bar going down the stairs. So that's the handrail set between that 30 and 38 inches in height. And then behind it, you see the stair rail. And that stair rail is going to be installed. In this case here, doesn't quite look to be 42 inches. But this is a residential stair rail and handrail. And so we see the difference. So right now, if you have a handrail that's at least 30 inches in height, it's okay. If you go to replace a handrail, you rebuild a set of stairs in your facility, you're going to need a handrail and a stair rail. And the issue is they realize that the handrails at even 38 inches get to be not quite tall enough to prevent people from falling off the sides of stairs. And so we need the handrail at a comfortable gripping height for safely going down the stairs. And then we need the stair rail to prevent people from falling off the stairs or over top the handrail. And so that's why we're going to see a combination. You don't need to go out and fix anything as long as it meets the requirements that have been in place for the last 40 years. I, of course, routinely find staircases that have handrails that are way too low, even do not meet the current code. Not frequently, but occasionally you find them. And then in the upper right hand is a small picture that shows you that you measure the handrail height or the stair rail height from the riser at the leading edge of the stair. So it's just behind the leading edge of the stair in line with the riser is the proper way to measure. Some minor details on handrails. OSHA actually used to be you had to have 3 inches of finger clearance for handrails. OSHA lowered that to 2¼ inches to be consistent with building code. Have to be a smooth surface. We don't want to prevent catching, snagging, punctures, lacerations. If you have the vertical elements of a stair rail can have openings no greater than 19 inches. And handrails must be of a shape and dimension that employees can grasp. And so this is going to be a minor issue. Sometimes I see 2x6s put on edge with a gap, and that probably isn't of a shape and dimension that you can easily grasp. And so there's going to be, OSHA didn't want to clarify what they meant by this, but you can see there is some concern about, they want to make sure an employee can get their hand on it and grasp it so they can prevent themselves from falling downstairs or tripping going upstairs. Want to make sure that the ends of handrails do not pose a projection hazard, and consistent with before, handrails, guardrails, all must be capable of supporting a 200-pound load outward or downward. Going to dock boards. OSHA changed dock boards a little bit, but for most businesses that we deal with that I see usage of dock boards, it's not going to be a major impact. The dock board is just that device that goes between the dock and the truck or the trailer, the vehicle being loaded to prevent, safe passage. Any dock board put into service after January 1st, 2017 must be designed, constructed, and maintained to prevent vehicles from running off the dock board edge. So you can see on this right dock board, it has a lip on it to prevent forklifts from running off. However, OSHA says, look, if your truck's back so close to your dock that there's no gap between the trailer and the building to drive off that edge, then you don't need to worry about it. You can use a traditional dock board like you see on the left-hand side. Primarily, this is going to be come into play if you're loading rail cars, and I don't know if we have any insureds that load rail cars, but usually that gap is pretty large, and then you can potentially fall from that. And so if you could get a forklift between the dock and the rail car, you'd clearly need one with edges or sides on it. And again, this applies to dock boards put into service. So if you already have a dock board and you have a large gap, you don't really have to worry about it until you replace it, and then you need to get a new dock board that meets the requirements. OSHA then says, look, if you have people walking on the dock board and they can fall to 4 feet or more to a lower level, then you need to have guardrails on it. But if you're between 4 and 10 feet, we're not going to require guardrails as long as you train employees following the requirements that we'll talk about later, 1910-30. And so it gets to be goofy. OSHA says, look, if there's a potential to fall off, if there's a gap that they can fall off the dock board and there's more than 4 foot or more fall to a lower level, put guardrails on the dock board. But if you're between 4 and 10 feet, instead of using guardrails, you can simply utilize training. And I apologize for the ringing in the background. And so they do give you some flexibility. In a lot of cases, again, there's simply no room to fall between the dock and the truck. I have seen some, however, that do have room, and so that is a potential concern. Continuing on, anytime an employee we get into the general fall protection requirements now. And what OSHA specifically states is that anytime an employee is working 4 or more feet above a lower level, they must be protected from falling. Now, they give some exceptions. They say, look, if you're working from a ladder, you don't need to worry about fall protection. If you're working from scaffolding that meets the requirements, you don't need to worry about fall protection. If you're working from an entertainment stage or a rail station platform, you don't need to worry about fall protection. If you're worried about aerial lifts and powered platforms, all these things have mandatory fall protection or exempt from fall protection, and so you don't need to worry about that. But if you have an employee working on a roof of your building, or if you have an employee working on a platform, or you have a mezzanine, or you've built a platform to get to a machine that's 4 or more feet above the lower level, then the employee must be protected from falling. One exception, and I think this is a major one for some of you, is that if you have employees going into this platform, roof, etc., that's over 4 feet, if they're inspecting, investigating, or assessing workplace conditions prior to the start of or after the work has been completed, you do not need to worry about fall protection. But it only applies to the inspecting, investigating, and assessing. It doesn't apply to any work. So me as an insurance person, it means I can go up onto the roof, I can look around the roof, and I don't have to worry about fall protection as long as I don't do any work. Now, if there is a fall protection system already in place on the roof, such as davits for tying off for a personal fall arrest system, then I need to utilize that equipment. But if it's a traditional roof and they've put no anchorage points in, there's no designated anchorage system, there's no guardrail system, I can go up, I can inspect, investigate, assess without utilizing fall protection. But this is a major issue because OSHA has finally clarified if you have employees going on a roof, for example, you're going to have to do something to protect them. And that's one of the last things we'll talk about in this presentation. OSHA used to mandate guardrails. OSHA always said guardrails, guardrails, guardrails. But now OSHA says, look, you can use a guardrail, you can use a safety net system, or you can use a personal fall protection system. I'm not going to go into a safety net system because I don't think they'll be used often. There's very specific requirements for them. Guardrails are still really the best form of protection because it's passive, but OSHA recognizes it doesn't make sense to put guardrails up everywhere that you may need them. Guardrails, I don't want to provide a lot of detail, but same basic requirements apply. One of the things OSHA has finally recognized that you can have screen or mesh between the top rail and the walking and working surface. They just say that if you have screen or mesh, it must extend from the walking and working surface to the top rail. And if you use vertical members, just no openings more than 18 inches. It used to be OSHA had a very traditional view of a guardrail. You have a top rail and mid rail, and that's it. And they said, look, we understand there may be differences. And you can use other things. You might have a short wall, and as long as that wall is at least 42 inches, plus or minus 3 inches, that wall then serves as your guardrail. You don't have to put a guardrail inside a wall, for example, or a parapet up on a roof. And so OSHA is a little flexible, but they recognize the way the law was written in the past is very specific. Guardrail force requirements, you can read through that. Again, want to make sure they're smooth surface, don't want to cause lacerations, catch on clothes, snag clothes. We want to make sure that the ends of the top rails and mid rails do not overhang the terminal posts and create a puncture hazard. So up in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of, a traditional guardrail system, and you can see that top rail in that top picture sticks out a little bit, and that poses a projection hazard. The top middle picture just shows mesh that goes all the way from the toe board up to the top rail. The upper left-hand photo is a portable guardrail system that's up on a roof to allow protection of employees performing maintenance and access. Lower left-hand, that is a guardrail system on a mezzanine. That guardrail system is not appropriate, however, because we have material that's too close to that guardrail that could be knocked off that. And so in this case here, we either need to move the product back so it can't fall over the guardrail if it were hit, or we need to extend the barrier up to prevent those materials from falling over. The middle picture at the bottom, that is vertical members, which technically would be appropriate. However, I'm not sure how OSHA would view this because while it's decorative and it meets the intent, I think the vertical members should go all the way to the bottom of the top rail. And then in the lower right-hand picture is just your traditional guardrail that we typically see in a manufacturing facility. Want to make sure you don't get barriers confused with guardrails. Barriers are designed to prevent people and traffic from going into an area. And so we see barriers here to keep people out of a conveyor system and from running into a ductwork on a spray paint booth. The barrier, however, poses a projection hazard. But, these do not meet the requirements of a guardrail. The barrier on the left-hand side doesn't have a mid-rail, and to me, the barrier on the right-hand side poses a projection hazard. But these are barriers. They're designed to keep traffic equipment out of an area, not prevent falls. So a personal fall arrest system, or a personal fall protection system, as I said, OSHA says you can use guardrails, safety net, or a personal fall protection system. We have fall arrest systems, travel restraint systems, and positioning systems are all acceptable to OSHA. A fall arrest system stops a fall. It's the easiest way I can convey that. So upper left, we have a track system that the employee clips onto that if he were to fall, the lanyard he's attached to would keep him from hitting the ground. Upper right, this is an overhead cable system above rail cars so employees can inspect and fill rail cars. Lower left is a track system, and they're working on top of an RV, and it allows them to have multi-directions. It moves right and left and forwards and backwards as they move in that RV here. It's a multi-track system. It's made by Gobel, G-O-B-E-L, EL, I believe. I hope I have that right. They have a lot of different type of track systems, and they also make the one in the lower right. But again, it's an overhead fall arrest system. This is on a beam that moves just like a hoist system might move, but it's engineered specifically to meet the requirements of fall arrest, and I can't stress that enough. I'm not going to go into those requirements as part of this presentation, but it's specifically designed to stop a fall. Other examples of fall arrest systems, left-hand picture, that is a portable anchorage system. So each of those is a 45-pound weight. You take that up, you place it onto the plate, and then the employee can tie off on that. So it takes some time to set that up, but it provides a portable system for a roof anchor in this particular case. The picture in the center is an overhead track system for employees that can load, unload semi-trailers, and tarp semi-trailers. OSHA doesn't specifically come out and say they can or cannot issue a citation when you're tarping at semi-load. It's convoluted because the DOT regulates semi-trailers and train cars. And technically, OSHA can't specifically say that they have to have fall protection. However, if you're on the goods themselves, does DOT regulate that? And that's really odd gray area. And OSHA doesn't comment, the DOT doesn't comment. But give it some consideration. If you have employees working on stacked goods or employees working on trailers, tarping the loads, securing loads, they fall off. We see a lot of injuries in our truckers. And do you need to provide some type of fall protection? And I can't answer that question, sadly. Upper right hand, that is a beam anchor. That anchor clamps to a steel beam, and so it provide as long as the beam's appropriate, can withstand the load, provide an anchorage point for working overhead. And then lower right-hand side, that is a roof anchor. And roof anchors can be installed at any time. It doesn't have to be something that's installed when a roof is new or the building is built. You can go back and have a roofing firm and properly engineer a roof anchor system and put that in place. Your roofers would do the work. However, it needs to be an engineered system. Make sure what you're anchoring that anchor into has the ability to withstand the necessary pull-out forces. Permanent roof anchors also have testing requirements or certification requirements. There's a lot of things you need to go into. Another example of fall arrest systems, both of these are moved by forklifts. You can set them in place. One's a single point. The one on the left is a single point anchorage system. The one on the right is a track type system, so that it gives the employee the ability to walk, up and down a trailer or whatever it was designed for. One of the inherent issues with fall arrest systems and choosing a fall arrest system, it's not some type of wonderful panacea. We'll put a person in a harness. We know we have this anchorage point, which is a problem to know that you have something that can withstand the loads of an anchorage for falling. It's the fall clearance. And it's small, but in the upper left is using a retractable lanyard. These people say that you need about 18.5 feet from where that retractable lanyard is anchored to the ground to prevent injury. If you use just a cross-arm strap, and this is where you wrap a rated strap around a steel beam, for example, they're saying you need 20.5 feet. So if you're trying to protect an employee from a 6-foot fall, a fall protection system, fall arrest system really isn't going to be appropriate. They're going to hit the ground before that system ever activates. And then down at the bottom, you just have a lanyard system. And I think I'm having a hard time on my slides reading that. Again, that's 18.5 feet with a lanyard. And so you need to have that anchorage point really high when you have a fall height, less than 18, 19 feet. And so that's going to create some challenges. And so right away we're going back to, can we use a ladder to access it? Can we use another type of fall protection system? Can we use a guardrail? A travel restraint system is another type of system. A travel restraint system simply prevents you from falling. It doesn't allow you to get close enough to an edge to fall over. The picture on the left is clearly a restraint system. It's a fixed lanyard, and he can't get over that roof edge. The picture on the right, depending on how it was designed and used, may be a fall arrest system or a travel restraint system. If his lanyard allows him to go over the edge of that roof, then it's a fall arrest system. If it does not allow him to get over the edge of the roof, then it's a restraint system. And there's different engineering requirements for both. It takes a lot less force to keep somebody back than it does to arrest them once they begin to fall. And so the picture on the left, the picture on the right, is hopefully designed as a fall arrest system, but it technically could be a fall restraint system. And lastly, we have a positioning system. A positioning system prevents a fall only by supporting the person to allow them to work with both hands. I don't believe many of you will find uses for positioning systems where another type of protection would be appropriate. Not saying it's not possible, it's just very limited application for a positioning system. Typically, I think we'll see more travel restraint systems utilized, and we'll talk about why that is here in a second. There is an exception for residential roofs. Now, don't get excited. OSHA specifically comes out and says, look, this doesn't apply to nursing homes, hotel, or similar facilities. Just because it looks like a residential roof, it's not a residential roof. That doesn't apply. But if you're a service provider, maybe you're DirecTV or Dish or somebody, and you're putting up dish antennas on people's homes, it says, look, you don't have to use a guardrail safety net, or personal fall protection system. You can utilize a fall protection plan if you can demonstrate that the other protective measures are not feasible. So it's very, very limited in nature. But if any of you do residential roof work, not as construction activity, but as a general industry activity where you have to go onto residential roofs, maybe HVAC work, antenna installation, DirecTV installation, dish, etc., then there is an exception. OSHA also says, look, we have an exception for loading racks and docks, and most of you would never have a loading rack, but you might have a dock, is that if there's a fall hazard greater than more than 4 feet, and a traditional fall protection system is not feasible, then certain exceptions to certain things can be done. Now, for the vast majority of you, if you have a loading dock that's more than 4 feet from the outside surface, you can put a temporary guardrail across. And you, as the employer, have the burden of proving that it's just not feasible to use traditional fall protection system. And so this exemption doesn't apply a lot, but I did want to talk about it just because it is new to the standard. Here's a big one. OSHA made a slight change in the wording of what they proposed to what the final standard was. They talk about hoist areas, and you think about hoist areas and something needs to be hoisted up. And they removed the word hoisted. And OSHA specifically says a hoist area is any elevated access opening to a walking or working surface through which equipment or materials are loaded or received. So a typical mezzanine that has a gate that slides or chains that go across that you can move material onto, like with a forklift, OSHA says, look, in these hoist areas, employees need to be protected. If a guardrail is used and removed for hoisting and the employee reaches through or over the edge, they must be protected by a fall arrest system. So if the employee has to reach across to grab the pallet to help pull the pallet across or reach across to grab boxes, you need to have a fall arrest system. I have a picture here of a type of movable guardrail system. You can see it in 2 different positions. In the first position on the left-hand side, it's set to receive a pallet. And then you lift up the guardrail from the mezzanine, and it drops on the other side so it provides fall protection. But it's a common system we see utilized in mezzanines. There's nothing wrong with using a gate. Slide the gate out, pallets pushed on, employee can go push the gate back. But if you have a situation where maybe you open the gate up, but employees are picking boxes across the gap between the pallet and the mezzanine, you need to provide a fall arrest system of some type, and that's the only thing that's permitted. I want to talk about holes. OSHA specifically states they changed the definition of a hole to be in line with the construction industry. A hole is anything that's an opening that's 2 or more inches in the least dimension. If the hole is 4 or more feet to the lower level, you need to cover the hole using a guardrail system or travel restraint. I know a lot of facilities have holes that are like 2 inches by 4 inches, and they've never thought about guarding it. Yes, it needs to be guarded. It needs to be covered, whatever is appropriate. If it's less than 4 feet to the lower level, you still need to protect that hole. OSHA is saying, look, you don't need a fall arrest system, but you need a cover on it or a guardrail system. I mentioned not forgetting skylights. If you have employees going up on your roof and you have skylights, you need to make sure that skylight cover is rated to hold the anticipated load should somebody fall down, sit on it. A lot of fatalities still happen because people sit on skylights and they fall through. Skylights, the majority of them, are not rated for that type of load. So I've shown a picture here of a portable skylight guard. and a permanent skylight guard. And no, that's not just some wire fence somebody bent over the top of that. That is specifically rated, and it has a capacity rating. So if you have employees going on a roof and you think, oh, they're working near the middle of the roof and there's no potential for them to fall, if you have skylights, they need to be protected when employees have access. OSHA also goes into talking about ladderways. Specifically, they talk about the sides of ladderways must be protected by a guardrail and toe boards. And on the left-hand side, you see like going into a sewage pit, a water pit, where that ladder is not protected, or that opening is not protected by a guardrail. And on the right-hand side, you see a situation where they have a ladderway and it's protected by a self-closing gate, and that's part of OSHA's new requirements. It used to be that employers would have like a ladder going up to a mezzanine and then just put chains across it, and chains are no longer required. You need to go buy a $150, $200 self-closing gate. And so as an employee approaches that from the inside, it just hits up against the guardrail. OSHA says, look, if you have an offset, such as an L-shaped guardrail there that prevents employees from walking directly into the ladder opening, that's also okay. In most cases, you don't want to spend the money, because you're going to find that a self-closing gate is going to be cheaper than building handrails out, guardrails out to provide an offset. So this is a major change, and this is one that some of you may have to go and fix right away, because you do have ladders that just have chains across. And OSHA is saying, look, no longer permitted. Hatchways, OSHA's provided a lot more guidance on hatchways. I'm going to say, look, go to the specific regulations. But basically, when that hatch is open, you need to have guardrails in place to protect it. It doesn't say you need to have the self-closing gate. I show two examples here just because I like the self-closing gates. But if you have a hatchway, you need to make sure that the self-closing, that you're guarding the opening. If you're passing material through the hatchway, you may need to have a fall arrest system or fall restraint system so you don't have somebody fall down the hatchway if guardrails aren't in place. And so see the specific regulations about hatchways. OSHA continues on about talking about dangerous equipment. They talk about equipment such as bat, tanks, electric equipment, or machinery with protruding parts or other similar units that because of their function or form may harm an employee who falls into or onto the equipment. It needs to be protected. And this is pretty consistent with what it was before. If you're less than 4 feet above the dangerous equipment, unless it's guarded or covered, you need to provide a guardrail or travel restraint system that's required. If you're 4 or more feet above dangerous equipment, you can either use guardrails or fall protection system, fall arrest, fall restraint, or a safety net. So you just need to keep in mind, if you have dangerous equipment you could fall into, regardless of the height, you need to make sure it's protected so people can't fall into it. Typically, a lot of equipment's guarded, but I have been into paper processing facilities where they have large floor openings that aren't really guarded that you could step into and be potentially injured. They talk about wall openings, and this is a change. Wall openings were kind of vague before. OSHA never really got into it, but if the wall opening is less than 39 inches on the inside, the surface side that employees are working on, and they can fall 4 feet or more through the outside of it, then you need to guard that opening. But as long as that inside dimension is greater than 39 inches or greater, you're okay. One of the things that I think of is trash compactors. If you have a really low trash compactor opening, even if it's an interlock door, if they can fall through that and they can fall more than 4 feet to the outside, you may have an issue that you need to address. From an ergonomics perspective, it's bad because now we're saying, hey, you got to lift that trash higher to get it into the chute. Sometimes we find that the trash compactors, we don't drop that far on the outside. So it's a case-by-case basis. And there's a whole different set of requirements that apply to trash compactor chutes and guarding of trash compactors that OSHA doesn't even get into as part of the fall protection standard. Another major change is OSHA says, look, if you have a repair and service pit in your facility, like you go to a express oil place and they have the repair pit underneath, you no longer have to provide fall protection as long as you do some other things, as long as it's less than 10 feet deep. But they say, and you can read it there, but if you have a repair and service pit and you have it guarded now, I would encourage you to keep it guarded because it is the safest, it's the passive way of protecting it. But if you're building a new pit and you don't want to guard it, OSHA says here's the things you have to do if you don't want to guard it. Now, from a liability perspective, if you have guests coming into your facility and they fall into that pit, OSHA's regulations aren't going to protect you from that lawsuit because it's easy to guard a pit. It's easy to have the rolling grates that go over the pit opening, but OSHA's decided to be a little more generous. Here's the thing I want to talk about. I apologize for going over the hour, but this is really the part that's going to impact the majority of you, and this is work on low-slope roofs. This is where your employees need to get up on the roof to look at that ventilation unit, change out air filters, check the furnace out. First of all, a low-slope roof is any roof with a roof pitch of 4 in 12 or less. Anything more than 4 in 12, you have to have fall protection. No matter what it might be, you need to use a fall arrest system, a restraint system, guardrails, et cetera, to provide protection. But if it's a low-slope roof, OSHA gives you some flexibility. Specifically, OSHA has different categories. If you're working less than 6 feet from the roof edge, you have to have a fall arrest system or restraint system so that employee, should they fall off the roof, they're protected or they can't fall off the roof, or a guardrail system. If you're between 6 feet from the roof edge and 15 feet from the roof edge when you're working, you either need to use general fall protection, or if the work is infrequent and temporary, you may use a designated area. I'll talk about infrequent and temporary and what a designated area is. And then if the work is more than 15 feet or more from the roof edge, you can utilize a designated area, general fall protection, or if the work is infrequent and temporary, no fall protection is required. One of the keys here is anytime you're working more than 15 feet away from the roof edge, you have to have a rule enforced that the employees cannot go within 15 feet of the roof edge without fall protection. And here's a little illustration. The roof edge is on the right-hand side, working away the 6 feet, the 6 to 15, and the more than 15 feet away. I know a lot of you are excited about using a designated work area because it's a pain to put up a fall protection system. Might not be easily accomplished in all situations. So we want to talk about infrequent. OSHA says infrequent is something that happens only on occasion. And they specifically say like annual maintenance or monthly or quarterly replacement of HVAC filters is infrequent. Anytime you're doing something on a roof to a specific piece of equipment or a specific task on your roof more than once a month, that's frequent, and so you cannot use the designated work area exemption. And it needs to be temporary. The best rule of thumb OSHA came up with this and says, look, if it takes you longer to do the task than it would to set up a fall protection system, then it's not temporary. Temporary means it's short duration, it's a simple scheduled maintenance task or a minor repair where the task takes less time to perform than it takes to set up or install a fall protection system. But remember, some of these temporary fall protection systems really doesn't take a lot of time to set them up. Might take a few trips, but once I make those trips, I have the fall protection system set up. And the task must be completed at one time rather than repeatedly returning to the roof to complete the task, or if it's something that goes over multiple work shifts, that's also not temporary in nature. So it needs to be infrequent and temporary before you can use the designated area. So it is infrequent, it is temporary, you're going to use a designated area requirement. Employees must remain within the designated area while the work operations are underway. The perimeter of that designated area must be delineated by a warning line consisting of a rope, wire, tape, or chain. The requirements for a designated area warning line are different than the construction industry warning line. If you follow the construction industry one, you're good to go. The general industry one is much simpler to comply with. And employees must be trained on how to set up and use the designated area. The requirements for the warning line, it doesn't need to be flagged, but it must be visible from 25 feet. And the designated area should be erected as close to the work as possible, as close as the task permits. So we don't need to make a huge 50-foot diameter designated area if I only need 5-6 feet in which to perform the work. Need to make sure that that warning line is not less than 34 inches or no higher than 39 inches above the walking working surface, and that includes the sag at that low point. And it must be supported in a manner that pulling on one section of the warning line will not result in the slack being taken up in another. We want to make sure that that warning line is not shifting around and it gets too low. So that's the designated area, and I know a lot of you are excited about using it because that's how you're going to comply. But if that works within 6 feet of the roof edge, you have to provide some type of fall protection. Either work from a ladder from the ground to do the task, or you have to provide a restraint system or a fall arrest system, assuming that they wouldn't hit the ground before the fall arrest system would work. And you always have to keep that in mind with fall arrest systems. OSHA talks about protection from falling objects in the standard. They say, look, if employees are exposed to falling objects, the employer must ensure the employees wear head protection. And then you also need to erect toe boards or erect a canopy structure, or you simply keep employees from entering the area so they can't be hit by falling objects. We provide them with head protection, but then we still take other measures to prevent the likelihood that the falling object hazard would be present. And last but not least, OSHA put in training requirements. This is the first time there's been training requirements as part of the walking and working surface standard. Not everybody needs to be trained. Specifically, you need to be trained if you're going to use a fall protection system, a fall arrest system, a travel restraint system, those types of things. The training must occur, the initial training must occur before May 17, 2017, or upon initial assignment before the employee is exposed to the fall hazard. If employees need to be trained and what they need to be trained on. OSHA makes it very clear that the training must be by a qualified person. So that's a person who has a recognized degree, certificate, or professional standing, or who has extensive knowledge, training, and experience, and the demonstrated ability to solve or resolve problems related to the subject matter. OSHA recognizes that most facilities actually will have a qualified person. You're going to have a maintenance employee that understands the equipment. But you may initially have to rely upon the vendor to provide that training to your staff, and then your staff can train themselves. OSHA is not telling you have to go out and utilize outside expertise. They're just saying you need to make sure that the person you have doing the training is qualified. Specific training topics that are required: the fall hazards in the area and how employees recognize them, procedures to be followed, the correct procedures for installing, inspecting, and operating, maintaining, and disassembling the personal fall protection systems, and correct use of the personal fall arrest protection systems. So again, not all employees need to be trained in this. You know, there's no requirement to use a ladder to be trained. But if you decide to use the alternative protection measures for dock boards or for the repair pits, or you choose to use a designated area for roof work, then there needs to be training for those employees. In addition to the training topics on the physical hazards, the fall hazard, you also have to provide training on the equipment hazards. So that's the proper care inspection of the equipment covered by the regulation, how to prevent secure dock boards if the dock board exemption is if you're using that, how to utilize a rope descent system, which I said none of you will likely ever do that, and then how to train each employee who uses a designated area and the proper setup and use of the area. OSHA goes on to state that the training must be understandable, and they just use the word understandable, so you need to make sure if the person's deaf, it's done in a way that they can understand, either read it or sign language. If they don't speak English, you need to provide it in a language that's appropriate. And you can utilize any training format. It does not have to be hands-on. It does not have to be a lecture. It can be computerized, video-based, whatever you want. But OSHA does say that you may have to have a qualified person available to answer any questions and clarify any information. And so think about that. If you don't have the qualified person doing the training, how does the employee get feedback to, answer questions, concerns they may have regarding the training content? OSHA then goes on to provide specific requirements for retraining. And that gets us almost to the end of this presentation. I thank you very much for sticking with me for 10 minutes longer. But review here, we need to make sure that you're doing your inspections. Inspections are required of everybody. The frequency of the inspection you need to determine based upon, the hazards and the use of the area and what. So you determine the necessity and the frequency of doing the inspections. You need to make sure you're identifying any tasks over 4 feet in height that our employees are performing where they're not protected by our guardrail system. What are you going to do to protect those employees? They're working on a flat roof. What are you going to do? These are all decisions that need to be made. You need to train any affected staff, should you have any. Not all of you will even have any affected staff, but I bet most organizations are doing roof work. They just don't like to admit to it. They have somebody going up and looking at the HVAC systems, or looking at ventilation fans, or cleaning fans, those types of things. And it's now time for your organizations to address the issue and figure out how you're going to do that safely. And then keep in mind, you have 20 years to address any fixed ladders over 24 feet in your facility to put a fall arrest system on those ladders. Just like then, a positive note, OSHA has given me 20 years to come into compliance with that fall arrest systems on fixed ladders. I ask if you have any questions, concerns, feel free to chat me. You can always email me after the presentation or give me a call after the presentation. I want to make sure if you have any questions about OSHA's new fall protection requirements, you get those questions answered. You can also ask your urgent loss control representative, and they'll be more than happy to either answer the question for you or get the question to me so I can answer it for them. I'd like to tell you the topic for next month's webinar. However, I have no idea what it is. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I thank you all very much for your attendance today and your attentiveness to this presentation. Thank you.